Today we will talk about inflation from the point of view of an ordinary consumer. We will understand how to measure it and how to use the consumer price index for this. We will understand how it works and what these numbers mean. What is inflation? How our index is arranged? We discussed in another video. You can go to them using the links in the description. Let's go. Despite the fact that inflation is an inevitable and sometimes even beneficial process for the economy, for the average consumer it is an extremely unpleasant thing. Everyone is complaining about rising prices. But our task is to approach this issue objectively, that is, to understand how much prices have actually increased. And, since this question is of interest to absolutely everyone, this is what the Consumer Price Index was invented for. This index shows how much the prices have actually risen. It is arranged quite complicated, so we go from the other end. First, we will try, so to speak, to reinvent the wheel, that is, to figure out how we would consider such an index. And, by gradually increasing complexity, we will understand how it is actually considered. Imagine that we have some fictional state. And you head the national statistics body for such a state. Our task is to calculate how prices have changed over the past period. But, in fact, the question that interests us is, how did the population's spending change? Experiment number 1. Take the price of bread. We consider was and has become, we divide one into another, and, a mistake. It turns out that men and women eat different amounts of bread. There are people who do not eat bread at all, and there are those who consume it quite a lot. But that is not all. It turns out that some people like wheat bread, others like rye bread, and still others prefer varieties with special additives. That is, in order to understand how the spending of the population has changed, we need to take into account not only the quantity but also the quality. One price for one type of bread is no longer enough. In addition, we need to remember those who do not eat bread at all. They eat other foods. Thus, it is necessary to take into account not only one product in the cost of food. We make the necessary adjustments and make a new calculation. Imagine, we even did everything perfectly. However, the value obtained is far from the real figure. What's the matter? The fact is that a person does not only eat. He also has utility expenses. There are expenses for clothes, for transport, for communications. There are also a lot of other expenses. Do you feel how complicated our task is? We are doing a new experiment. Imagine that we, too, were able to take all this into account and correctly calculate. We get the result. The value is already closer to the truth, but still incorrect. What's the matter? It turns out that prices are still different in different places. For residents of cities, metropolitan areas, and rural areas, there is a spread in prices for the same goods. That is, not only does the structure of consumption differ for different people, in addition, it turns out that prices change depending on where this person lives. Please note that at the moment the task of calculating the level of expenses for the population has become so complicated that the possibility of obtaining the correct result seems to be problematic. What to do? And now, when you understand the complexity of the task that the statistics service of any country faces, we will talk about how this indicator is actually calculated. Since accounting for price changes for absolutely all goods is a clearly impossible task, the situation is simplified. They form the so-called consumer basket, which includes only the most basic and most purchased goods. Each country has its own methodology for forming a consumer basket, but usually it is the result of statistical studies that are conducted by surveys or direct monitoring of selected representatives of key population groups. How many data sources are needed? The United States Bureau of Labor Statistics says it processes information from 24,000 weekly spending diaries and 48,000 consumer interviews. Based on the received data, the so-called consumer basket is formed. That is, from the huge variety of goods sold, a limited list of goods is formed that are the most typical. And it is their prices that are taken into account. As you can see, by now the problem is mathematically simplified. We have a quite reasonable and limited number of sources of information and a quite reasonable and limited amount of goods, works, services and other household expenses. This set is called the consumer basket. At this stage, we have already understood what to monitor prices for. Second question, where? Now we need to take into account the demographic data of the population. Based on these data, Areas and price control points for goods and services included in the consumer basket are selected. The resulting recorded price changes are weighted by the importance of a particular good or service in the expenditure structure of the relevant population group. The data obtained is aggregated, averaged, grouped, and, in the end, one single figure is obtained. His figure tells us that the population's spending on average increased by this value. From this we can draw the following conclusions. The consumer price index as a whole for the state is considered correct. But, on the other hand, there is not a single individual consumer for whom the figure calculated on average corresponds specifically to his expenses. So how can we benefit from all this flood of numbers? For example, you can easily figure out how much a $2022 is worth in relation to a $2002. If your salary for this period has not changed in any way, here is the degree of weight loss of your wallet. And it can be calculated for any period. That is, thanks to the Consumer Price Growth Index, you can easily determine for yourself better or worse you began to live from this date to this date. Screen example. Everything is simple and clear. That's all. Questions, comments, suggestions, write in the comments. Subscribe to the channel. For likes, plus you in karma.